Once again, when I look at biblical law, it's not so much that they're unique, it's that they're placed in a unique context. And of course, if you're out there and you're thinking, no, wait a minute, the biblical stuff, this was handed down to Moses by God. It couldn't have any, evidence of being tarnished by outside material. If we find out that the Ten Commandments are not as unique as I thought, does this burst your bubble about divine inspiration? In my opinion, it shouldn't at all. It does force me to reevaluate my interpretive position about them. And so the problem isn't with God, it's with me.
Hear, hear, everybody. Welcome to the Buried Bible Podcast. I am the curious everyday layman, Keegan Walls, here with the Atticus Finch of old Mesopotamian law, Mark Chavalas. That was my gavel. Did you like that?
Yeah,
that was pretty good.
I like that.
Well, I'm gonna toss it over to you, but we're excited to be back. We just finished up Hammurabi Code, and today we want to look at the scribal tradition. We've been looking at the ancient law so that we can better understand the Old Testament law. And so today's focus is simply the scribal tradition making a connection from old, I just say ancient, but yes, obviously Mesopotamian, ancient Near Eastern law, and the Bible law. Because when you look at them, and a lot of people, a lot more today, we see the similarities between what we see in Mesopotamia, and the biblical laws, and there's a wrestle and a tension because they don't look that far off. And then that has Christians and non-Christians, has people going, well, what do we make of this? What the heck's going on? So scribal tradition, Atticus Finch, cross-examination. That's the only lawyer language I can think of. I'll give it to you.
Great. Well, I suppose if I'm a lawyer, I should apologize. That's the term. But anyway, today I want to look actually, before we get into the Bible, at least into the trenches, I want to see if we can find out any evidence of how these law codes from the ancient Near East, why are they so similar to the biblical text or vice versa? Is there any mode of transmission between the two? Because is there a missing link? And my answer is, well, somewhere in between yes and no. And I wanted to start off by looking at a couple notes that, and I mentioned this fellow probably dozens of times now, Raymond Westbrook, who really was one of the foremost ancient Near Eastern legal scholars for many years. And he wrote a note in perhaps for us, an obscure journal. It might not be in France, but the Revue Biblique. And in 1985, he wrote an article called Biblical and Cuneiform Law Codes. Catchy title, I know. And he wrote a note on page 253, which I thought was interesting. He said about the fact that the Codex Hammurabi was copied and recopied over about a millennium, and we have about 40 exemplars of the text. And I mentioned this before. And then he says this statement. He says, "It would be no surprise, therefore, to find similar codes compiled from the local law by Canaanite or Hittite scribes who were inspired by contact with Hammurabi's magnum opus," his great work. And of course, when he wrote this in 1985, so 40 years ago, it was entirely theoretical. What I mean is that he was hoping, I would expect to find some sort of Canaanite scribal tradition that would talk about legal texts. We already know that happened for the Hittites. They're way up in central Turkey. And in the late Bronze Age, I already talked about the Hittite codes, and we'll bring them up again when we look at parallels. So Westbrook was anticipating something, and he made a few other statements I thought that were interesting in this article. Here's his conclusion as to what the way the Hammurabi Code was probably used. And of course, every scholar has a slightly different opinion because we don't exactly know how it was used. And by way of analogy, I'm still not convinced I know exactly how the biblical text, the laws were used either.
Jury's still out on that one.
Yeah. Thanks for the tip. So he says on page 254, we suggest that the compiling of lists of legal decisions basically served a similar purpose. They were a reference work for consultation by judges when deciding difficult cases. I already talked about this, but for me to be affirmed by someone like Westbrook, it was pretty nice. In fact, I probably read this, and that's how I concluded this. In view of the association of most law codes with a king, it's reasonable to suppose that it was the king as judge, or at least the royal judges, that these lists were intended to serve. And by the way, we have royal courts and we have local courts. I suppose it's kind of like having, the Supreme Court and then, local Supreme Courts in states. In other words, they all have different jurisdictions. There is no direct evidence from cuneiform sources for the consultation of law codes as there is for the Omen series. I talked about Omen series. And by the way, the Omen series are referenced all the time. They probably had a bigger impact on daily life, by the way, because everything that happens to you, good or bad, is perhaps the result of some sort of, ominous occurrence. Then he talks a little bit about the other codes. I already talked about the other codes and what I thought they were for, but he zeroes in on a couple things. So, for example, the Assyrian text that I talked about, I said there's about 15 different types of tablets. The examples themselves are more. He says the vast collection, originally numbering 14 tablets, I think it's 15 now, is, as we have noted, not a royal inscription, nor is it a school text. So what is it if they're neither? Most of the tablets recovered were found, this is on page 255, in a gatehouse identified as the Gate of Shamash, which is the normal location of the courthouse in Mesopotamia. Shamash being the god of justice and the sun god, like I mentioned this before. And by the way, Ernst Weidner referred to them for this reason as a legal library for judges. You want to guess when Ernst Weidner said this? About 90 years ago in a German journal. It was the one that he published, Archiv für Orientforschung, in 1937. I'm sure you've been reading it, to prepare for this. So that's interesting that, in other words, they're there probably for consultation. Is there any concrete evidence that they're used this way? No, but the fact that these laws are found at the Gate of Shamash in a building means that that's probably what they were for. And then the Hittite tablets, the same thing. The collection was recopied over several centuries, and later copies still retain some archaic language. And so from that standpoint, he's showing that they certainly do look like there was something that would be consulted. But again, like John Walton said, and by the way, a spoiler alert, John's going to be on our show in a couple of weeks. I had to find somebody older than me, just for a quota, and John fits the bill. Yes. Now, one last thing he says I thought was interesting on page 257. To summarize, in our view, the ancient Near Eastern law codes derive from a tradition of compiling series of legal precedents in the same manner as omens, medical prognoses, and other scientific treatises. I think I talked about this 2 podcasts ago. The purpose of these series to act was a reference work for the royal judges in deciding difficult cases. I know that sounds redundant to what I just said, but I want to just hammer this home. So if this is the case, my next question that I'm going to try to answer now is, all right, is there evidence for how they got from this ancient Near East? We have evidence that they got to Anatolia. Is there any evidence they got into Canaan? And of course, if you remember what I told you about Canaan, is that the cuneiform tradition is pretty poor in Canaan, although it's not poor in Syria itself. And so I want to say a few words about the cuneiform scribal tradition and how it expanded. We didn't think much about its expansion in Syria until after the 1930s. And the reason for that is because nobody was digging in Syria, really, for the most part, until the late 1920s, early 30s. In 1933, the Iraqis made a law, really unfair law. They didn't allow the Europeans to take all of the artifacts home with them. They had to split them between the local government in Iraq and them. And you know what a lot of the European archaeologists did? They decided, well, we're going somewhere else where we can get all our artifacts. And so they went to Syria and Turkey and other places in the Near East, which didn't have the same rule. And once they started excavating in Syria, they found out, oh my goodness, the cuneiform tradition in Syria is almost as rich as it is in Mesopotamia proper. Well, they didn't know that because they hadn't excavated there. And of course, by the way, I'm a recipient of that tradition because, of course, this is where my director, Bucciolati, began excavating in the mid-70s, and I followed him up very soon after the beginning of that. So what about this cuneiform tradition? Inland Syria is actually part of Mesopotamia proper, if you continue north. And where do we find that cuneiform? Well, first of all, the urban tradition is found by the end of the 4th millennium, beginning of the 3rd millennium. We have planned urban centers up in the north just as fully developed as they do in southern Mesopotamia proper. So it wouldn't be surprising if we found a cuneiform tradition. Of course, the Ebla tablets that were uncovered beginning, by the way, in the late 60s, but the big tablet cache began right about circa 1975, showed that there was a cuneiform tradition by at least the middle of the 3rd millennium, writing, with sumerograms in perhaps Ebla Akkadian or Eblite, depending on your point of view. And by the way, since then, in the last 30 years before the political problems in Syria, they've found, archive after archive, many of them from the 3rd millennium, in a variety of areas, showing that the scribal tradition expanded much earlier than we thought. Ebla, of course, is along the coast, but inland Syria has a tremendous amount of material. Also, we can excavate at Aleppo, by the way, which was considered to be a significant political center in the Old Babylonian period. So, who knows what we could find there. But this scribal tradition was very powerful in the early Bronze, Middle Bronze, and then even in the Late Bronze Age. And so along the coast of the Euphrates, at the site of Amar, which was a salvage site in the 70s, they found thousands of texts and a lot of scribal copies of a whole variety of curriculum texts, etc. So we certainly have evidence for a scribal tradition. Amar, which I think I'll probably devote an entire podcast on at some point, even probably better known to a lot of you out there will be the site of Ugarit on the coast, which I've talked about before, which had also a very heavy Akkadian cuneiform scribal tradition, but also they wrote in, it manufactured a cuneiform alphabet, by the way, and we're now finding that it actually goes back 1,000 years more. If you look at in places in Syria, the alphabet is. We thought it was about 1900 BC. Now we're finding evidence of the alphabet going back to about 2400 BC, and so we keep on finding things that push back our the limits of our understanding, I suppose, if I can just make up a phrase. So Ugarit has a very powerful scribal tradition, school texts, etc. Ekalte along the again along the Euphrates, and in Canaan itself, the tradition is very poor, but it does exist. They've actually found a fragment. I think I mentioned this before. A fragment of a text in Jerusalem itself. Jerusalem is mentioned heavily in the Amarna letters in Egypt, which are cuneiform texts, probably done by Canaanite scribes for an Egyptian audience. And there's also a curriculum, a wide array of curricula there also. And also at Hazor, and I'm going to be talking about Hazor, where they found, I know this doesn't sound like very many texts, about 18 texts. I'm going to talk about the fact that at Hazor in the north, it's clearly a Canaanite town. We found 18 texts. A number of them are fragments of a cuneiform law collection, which looks, at least in terms of content, like a Hammurabi or Eshnunna code, but they're not identical to it. And so if you're wondering what would the Hebrew scribes have been looking at, my answer is, were they looking at the Hammurabi code? My answer is no, probably not the exact Hammurabi code, but they were looking at ancient Near Eastern legal codes that were Hammurabi-like, if that makes any sense. And I think I already told you this before, is that, for example, in Syria right now, the cuneiform tradition, we've probably uncovered, I don't know whether it's 100,000 texts, but it's 30, 50, 70,000, documents or more from Syria proper. In Anatolia, they continue to find texts, not simply at the capital of Hattusha, but in surrounding regions. Cuneiform texts keep on popping up, not simply from the late Bronze period, but also pre-Hittite material. So there's a rich tradition going back, a millennium. But when you get to Canaan, it's very, very sparse, and the total cuneiform output is less than 100 tablets, but approximately 20% of them are at Hazor. And so I decided to take a look at an article here by Horowitz and a few other scholars in the Israel Exploration Journal 62. The year is 2012. So this is not quite 30 years after Westbrook made his remark about hoping that we would find a legal tradition. I want to read a couple of excerpts of what these folks have said about this Hazor text. Here's their abstract. In fact, they even quote Westbrook up here about the fact that, we're hoping that they would find, we expect that they would find something. And so, they've been reading Westbrook. So they said 2 fragments of a traditional cuneiform law collection of the type best known from the laws of Hammurabi were recovered in the Hazor excavations in the summer of 2010. You think about it, that's not that long ago from now. The fragments inscribed on local clay In other words, these weren't simply transported from Mesopotamia. In order for them to have local clay, that means you've got to have scribes living in Hazor doing it. I know that sounds pretty obvious, but it is rather important. The fragments inscribed in local clay and dating from the Middle Bronze Age. Middle Bronze would mean Old Babylonian period, so roughly Hammurabi type period. Preserve parts of 7 laws. That doesn't sound like much, but it's something. A group of laws on the larger fragment, fragment A, concerns the hire of slaves to third parties and compensation to be paid to the owner of the slave in the case of the injury to the slave. The presence of a law collection in cuneiform Hazor confirms the place of Middle Bronze Age Hazor as a Western cuneiform center of the first rank. In fact, if you look at the Bible, Hazor is, what is it called in Joshua? The head of all those kingdoms. In other words, it's a big cheese out there. You like that analogy?
That was pretty good.
Especially since we're in Wisconsin. Thank you. I needed affirmation, by the way. Thank you. So, where was I?
Big cheese.
But it implies that Hazor is probably considered to be part of Syria rather than Canaan, at least from the standpoint of this legal collection. In terms of scribal tradition, once we hit Hazor, when you go further south, our evidence is pretty much zero until, by the way, you get into Egypt, where we actually have some Old Babylonian exemplars in the Delta region that were found. And of course, the Amarna tablets for the late Bronze Age, which were much further south. In between, like I said, the evidence that we have is, I think, rather firm. You have the Amarna text being incoming letters from Shechem, from Jerusalem, from elsewhere. The only way that that's going to happen is if you have scribes living in those places, writing to them. And so the fact that we haven't found tablets there it just means that we haven't found the tablets, but we have the literary evidence that something must have been going on there. And so this is at least giving us a background for understanding, that the Hebrew scribal tradition, obviously they're not using the cuneiform tradition later on. They're using, an alphabetic tradition that we'll perhaps go into later on. They certainly know the cuneiform tradition, and somehow they're using it, and they're taking advantage of it. Now, of course, like I keep on saying, the Israelites are not living in a cultural vacuum. They're part of this system. It's not like, they're not looking for things to borrow, but they're certainly taking advantage of a common legal tradition. There's a couple of things I wanted to bring up in here about these texts. This actually gives you an edition of the tablets themselves. I don't know whether you're going to be able to see this very well, but sometimes cuneiform scholars, this is all they have to go on. It's a fragment of a tablet from Hazor that has a legal text, or legal material on it. This one simply says, if the cheek of the slave he has slapped, and the slave to the owner of the slave, and then it's broken. Then it says, if a man the ear, and then on the slave, and the owner of the slave. In other words, that's all they got. But just by reading that, if you're a Hammurabi, if you're a legal specialist, you're realizing, oh, we've got these if-then clauses right here, and the content is talking about stuff that you would find, in the other legal material itself. And so, and that's all they have to go on, which isn't very much. And by the way, what that means is that, of course, they're making conclusions. Now, I want to show you Horowitz's and the like. What their conclusions are. I'm on page 173 of this article, by the way. He says the dating of Hazor 18 to the Middle Bronze Age on the basis of its ductus places our text within the context of contemporary tablets found both at the site and throughout the ancient Near East. All right, so that's repeating what I already said. The repertoire of Middle Bronze Age, Old Babylonian period cuneiform texts at Hazor, although limited in number, derives from a wide range of genres. Now, in other words, they're now going to say, all right, we've got a couple of these legal, these law code, I'm going to use the term code in quotes, exemplars. So now, but what else do we have there? In other words, and where do they find this stuff? That's important. He says these texts include a wide range of genres. What are they? Oh, you ask. These texts include collections of omens on liver models. So in other words, and he even gives the Hazor number, a lexical text, a legal text, which I'm going to look at in a second, a mathematical text, and a scattering of letters and administrative tablets. When one adds the law collection fragments that were just found to this mix of genres, and here's the kicker, it seems likely that Hazor, the Hazor of the Middle Bronze Age possessed a fine collection of cuneiform tablets. And by the way, we're just, north we're north of the future kingdom of Israel, okay? And of course, we're centuries before it, but if you're wondering how this geographically speaking, this mode of transmission, we're at least getting somewhere here. Then he says, it seems likely that they possessed a fine collection of cuneiform tablets with only the absence of literature and perhaps royal inscriptions keeping the Hazor collection from being complete. In other words, it has so many different types of literary genres, except two big ones, of course, the royal inscriptions, which you would expect to find. Then he says, most important for understanding the contemporary context of Hazor 18 is the legal document Hazor 5, in which a lawsuit comes before the king for judgment. Well, if you have a lawsuit that comes before the king for judgment, you know what you need? You need a king. I know. I caught you. I know.
Mind blown.
I know I was too quick for you. Thus providing evidence for the place of the cuneiform writing system in Hazor's royal legal system, which you would expect. And here's the lawsuit. Ben Hanuta with Irpadu and Sum Hanuta, 3 junior attendants, initiated a lawsuit against Sumula Ilum, nice Babylonian name, in regard to a home and a garden in the city of Hazor and a garden in the city of Gilead. There's a question mark whether it's the correct reading. Before the king, they came in. The king, in favor of the case to Sumu La Ilum, rendered judgment, and then it's broken. Okay. Well, that's pretty cool. By the way, this was published 4 years before this text. The discovery of the legal material. Given that the fragments of Hazor are written on local clay and recovered on the Acropolis of the city, the high place where you would expect the palace to be, by the way, we may hypothesize that the laws of Hazor come from a royal collection that was promulgated in the name of the king of Hazor. By the way, I don't think they're going too far to say this. It seems much less likely that a fragment is a school tablet where laws from Hazor or elsewhere were copied onto Hazor clay as part of the school curriculum from training scribes. And if they were, of course, they had to modify them. By the way, so that's why, cuneiform scholars, especially now, are obsessed when they now find tablets being found, I think really since maybe the last 50, 60 years, they're pretty much obsessed with, where did you find the text? What was the location? In other words, I don't want to simply find a tablet for a museum. I want to know, where did you find this? Oh, you found it in a tablet school. You found it in a royal, a royal place, or in a temple complex, etc., or maybe in a trash pit or whatever. All of these, of course, are relevant to understanding, context, the meaning behind the text itself. This was not something that was understood well in excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so this is why, all the tablets in the British Museum, most of them are without original find spot. And so it's harder to understand their context and, of course, their meaning. Here, by saying this, you have a better understanding of the fact that these are probably not practice texts. If they are school tablets, they're done by high level, but they're for royal perusal, is what he's saying. He says, these are the markings of an experienced scribe rather than a novice. By the way, this goes against the statement that Sarah Milstein argues a little bit later on about this, is that she theorizes that even these could have been school texts, and then she theorizes that the biblical material also are school exemplars. I'm not compelled by it, even though I think she's done some really great work, very interesting work on this. Thus, we believe that our fragments ultimately come from a genuine copy of a local royal Hazor law collection. Okay. Then he muses, they muse. We cannot know on the basis of the current fragments whether our fragments represent a law collection of a single solitary tablet, or if they're part of a much larger collection of laws. By the way, looking at the size of the tablet, they theorized there might have been 30 or 40 laws on the tablet itself. Okay, maybe there were 32. They're just, again, musing. Then he says, in archaeology, the remains of Bronze Age Hazor form by far the largest tell in the land of Israel. Joshua 11:10 refers to Hazor in the early years as the head of all those kingdoms, and I mentioned that before. Hazor, the mound, is much larger than the things for this period. And by the way, Hazor is mentioned in the Mari letters, Old Babylonian period, along the along the Euphrates in inland Syria. Mari archives place a certain Ibni Adu as king of Hazor on an equal footing with his local contemporary Zimri-Lim, who is the king of Mari, and with Hammurabi. So Hazor is a very powerful center. In fact, I'm going to take a guess that the king of Hazor, if he is politically and equal to, let's say, Hammurabi, if someone had said, well, you guys must have copied the Hammurabi laws, he probably would have laughed and said, there's a common legal tradition. Believe me, we didn't copy those laws. There's a much larger legal tradition from where we're deriving our material. It's not just him. We didn't know that those were the ones that were going to survive. Then it says, this can also be demonstrated by the letter of Hazor 12, showing that Hazor has diplomatic ties with the cities of Syria, Mari, etc. Thus, the laws of Hazor, here's a summary statement on page 175. The laws of Hazor inscribed on Hazor clay may be viewed as further evidence of the position of Hazor as a kind of Babylon/Hattusha of the cuneiform far west. In other words, a city of the first and most important rank ruled by a great king. Now, by the way, what he did not have, they did not have as a goal in this particular article, was to say, all right, now that we have this, here's your missing link between here and, of course, Israel. Well, it's still too far, but it just shows, if you're wondering, if you're guessing that here's Moses, furiously copying, a text of Hammurabi just to, find a couple cool laws. No, it's much more complicated than that. So I like this idea. Now, I want to go one step further by looking at an article written by Samuel Greengus, another one of these great, legal, biblical / ancient Near Eastern, historians. And he wrote this in the journal Marav, M-A-A-R-A-V, in 1991. And here's the article named "Filling Gaps, Laws Found in Babylonia and in the Mishnah, but Absent in the Hebrew Bible." So think about it, that. Go figure. If and I've mentioned this before, like the ancient Near Eastern legal codes, when you look at the biblical text, they're missing a lot of topics. A lot of specific laws are not there. And so, if you're, are these supposed to be exhaustive laws? My answer is no, they're not. And so I want to look at some of the conclusions that Greengus makes in this article. Let's see if I can find his conclusions here. Yes, I could find it because it says conclusions on it. So on page 170 of this, he says, he's just looked at 6 different cases, by the way, showing that even in the New Testament, we have laws about, for example, taking people's cloak or slapping them in the face, etc. He says we have to give due weight to the fact that the above 6 cases, and you can look at the cases yourself, I don't want to look at them here, which demonstrate the Mishnah connection, all appear in the formal law collections of both cultures, meaning Babylon and in the Bible. This important literary position suggests that we are dealing with more than just coincident practice. Their retention in the formal codes argues for them having been part of a living legal tradition. And this is written, like I said, 35 years ago, that was widely shared and preserved over many centuries. So in this respect, the evidence from these 6 cases adds support to the theory of the direct connection put forward by scholars like Shalom Paul, who I have not brought up before, and then Westbrook. But their evidence goes even a bit further, suggesting that the cultural interaction of which they were a part continued to operate during the first as well as the second millennium BC. In other words, this isn't just in the first temple period, but even in the second temple period, where we continue to have a Babylonian legal tradition that is in the cuneiform system, is still influencing the West. Rabbinic legal traditions, as we have them now in written form, did not appear until much later. And of course, this is post-Christian. The Mishnah and Tosefta belong to a period after the 2nd century AD, if you like. But the rabbis believed that these compositions represented the written form of a more ancient oral law. And of course, this is well known to those of you who are in the Jewish tradition, which went back to the time of Moses. They believed that the oral law preserved older traditions as well as modifications enacted by religious and civil authorities who lived during the centuries prior to their own time. So at least I'm providing, I think, some evidence for the fact that, the evidence for the transmission of the ancient Near Eastern legal collections from the Near East into Anatolia, but also into Syria and into Canaan proper, certainly have strong evidence. And so it's not surprising. And of course, if you're out there and you're thinking, no, wait a minute, the biblical stuff, this was handed down, to Moses by God. It couldn't have any, evidence of, being tarnished by outside material. I guess my answer to that is just go back to our Circa 70 podcast. Everything we've been doing is to try to show that Israel fits quite well into the ancient Near East, even though it often takes something and provides a different meaning to it.
I'll let you give your rebuttal because I can hear people asking right away, but what about the 10 Commandments?
Oh, yes. Though I'm not going to talk about them right now, I will tell you that the Ten Commandments, for a while, we thought were pretty unique. And in principle, they are unique, at least in terms of how they're placed into this covenant. You think about it, the laws are placed in the Bible, especially at the beginning of Exodus and in Deuteronomy, in a covenant environment, okay, in the treaty. And so from that standpoint, the Ten Commandments, of course, are the first thing that are mentioned in this covenant, okay? Is there anything like them in the Near East? My answer is somewhere in between yes and no. And so, yes, I will probably give a one-day podcast or longer just with an overview of the Ten Commandments and the fact that the laws themselves, which, of course, if you think about it, are pretty basic. The fact that you're not supposed to steal or commit adultery, things that most civilizations really, they really can't exist without them, in many respects. Do we find exemplars like that in, for example, Mesopotamia? My answer is yes. Are they identical? No, but we will talk a little bit about them at some point. So once again, when I look at biblical law, it's not so much that they're unique, it's that they're placed in a unique context. And any Israelite is going to say, well, the fact that they're unique is because you are pledging allegiance to a singular entity, a single divine being who is demanding your allegiance. And this is, and in this legal contract that we're making, you are pledging to abide by that, by these Ten Commandments, and of course also by these, what I would argue, wisdom texts. In other words, you are going to regulate your society by using these legal materials to make legal and godly decisions on issues that occur in your culture, if that helps.
Yeah, but what about in regards to, just because obviously the statement of the laws are not in a vacuum, now again, not being copied, but very common to the ancient Near Eastern tradition. And then you make the statement of, well, they weren't handed down like verbatim from God. Again, people are going to say, but weren't the Ten Commandments?
Oh, yes, the Ten Commandments are, yes.
Okay. Just because I know people are going to say, well, what about those ones? So then...
And how that works, I don't know. I mean, all I'm asking you to accept is the idea that if you believe in divine inspiration, you have to accept the fact that divine inspiration has a much more wide-ranging understanding that we thought. In other words, did Paul know he was divinely inspired when he wrote a letter to the Corinthians? I suppose it's really irrelevant if you think about it, whether he understood that he was writing. In other words, did he know that this letter was going to be put into a corpus that would be considered canonical at some point? Probably not. That's my guess. And we also know that, of course, Paul wrote other letters that are non-extant. We don't have them. What would happen if we found them? That would be fun. Would they be stuck into the canonical corpus? The answer is maybe yes, maybe no. Let me. I was going to look at this book later, but I will right now. This is a really nice little book by Greengus, Laws in the Bible and Early Rabbinic Collections, where he expands upon that article. And I'm going to look on it's page 1. He actually answers this query. He says, although the biblical laws are said to be of divine origin, they were not considered so extraordinary as to be beyond human comprehension and attainment. And then he quotes Deuteronomy 30:11-14. And here's the quote. Surely this instruction which I enjoin upon you this day is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us and impart it to us, neither we may observe it, that we may observe it, neither is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who among us can cross to the other side of the sea and get it for us and impart it? No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to observe it. And then here's his comment. In other words, The divinely endorsed laws, this is now Greengus, were related to human history and experience. And as such, a good deal of what they mandated was already familiar to the ancient Israelites. This is because a substantial part of biblical law was based upon pre-existing Near Eastern law. And if you think about it, duh. I mean, again, I've brought this up before with other things that we've talked about. If God decided to make a legal system today in Wisconsin for, us farm people and everybody else who's living, in the 21st century, he would probably make laws that were relevant to our living situation. Okay, so to me, I would be suspicious if we had laws from Israel that weren't like their neighbors in many respects, because of course the subject matters, the situations would be similar. The fact that they're responding in similar situations shows that they're in similar environments. The Israelites are from Mesopotamia to begin with. So I like what he says here. And again, if we find out that the Ten Commandments are not as unique as I thought they are, does this burst your bubble about divine inspiration? In my opinion, it shouldn't at all. It does force me to reevaluate my interpretive position about them. And so the problem isn't with God, it's with me. That I've got this way to interpret things, and if I find out that it's wrong, am I going to move heaven and earth to keep my interpretation correctly? I think that's what people often do with chronology when they find out that it doesn't seem to fit, as well. Response. Where do you want to go on?
Do you have more?
Oh, we got more, unless the time's running out. You tell me.
Well, no, my one, which you kind of already talked about, it would just be, I think for the average layperson, like, how do you reconcile that? Because again, I don't know if it's a hill people are willing to die on, but again, it is a bit of a bubble pop. And so from your perspective, is it again kind of like what we talked about when we looked at, I think it was Genesis. I don't know. We've done so many podcasts; they all start to blend. Where it's just that again, God is meeting them where they are. He has an ultimate or big picture theological message and point, which is the redemption of souls themselves.
Yes.
And so he's meeting them in their ancient context, and because of that, the law being divinely inspired from Yahweh himself, could it potentially have bigger ramifications than just setting up some political law system? But again, it's that allegiance aspect. So there's more to it, right? So there's it's just not the surface level law. God gives us law, okay, and then you just live your lives. Now, obviously, it has everyday implications, but is there more depth to it, connecting it to this theological messaging and allegiance to Yahweh himself? So then so what he's doing again is putting it in a way that makes sense to them. And so when it's similar to these laws, there are these like micro adjustments to ultimately capture their heart, if that makes sense.
Yes, and of course the goal in capturing their heart is because, remember, I want you to put your allegiance into the God of Israel, the true God, in their mindset. And so for them, the difference is the source. I used to think it was a big deal that, well, the biblical laws, their ultimate source is divine, and the ancient Near Eastern laws, their ultimate source was the king. But the difference is not that vast, really, because the king ultimately gets his source from a divine source to begin with. And so it's simply, taking a step out here. And so what's the difference in the Bible? For them, the difference is that we're pledging allegiance to the monotheistic true God, the divinity that created the entire universe, who's in complete control of everything. And so So they would have seen that as the big difference, not so much that the Hebrew laws are much more advanced than the Mesopotamian laws. I suppose my answer is I don't know if they're so much more advanced in the fact that, in other words, they didn't think they were doing something new. They thought that what they were doing is they were placing their ancient Near Eastern legal tradition in the context of now a good and loving God who expected them to act like image bearers. Okay. And of course, if you look at it from that context, as Christians now in a New Testament era, I think it provides a better context for understanding them. And if you look at them now as wisdom texts, that they are they're guides to now use when you're trying to understand, how do I act, in this place and that place. We've already got the 10 words that gives us the basics. Now we've got the specifics that will help guide us in understanding how to operate when I'm not sure what happened when I just used part of your farm and I did it by accident. What do we do now? How do we operate, through love and mercy and all that? Well, this is our guide to do it. I
have more.
All right, go.
Sorry.
We might not even get to the biblical text today, but oh well.
I guess we'll find out.
Yeah.
Going off of that, is there, and I'm going to try my best, so hang with me, to make this make sense, what's up in my mind to you. Here we go. Is there something more to it? I'm going to try to almost think of it, because again, we think of it like a law, how we think of it today. Is it simply God, from your perspective, God giving them laws on how to act in society to put guardrails up, or is there something more to it in terms of, again, because I think it's easy for me to chop up in my mind, well, of course they sound similar because God is, in a sense, lowering himself to meet them where they're at,
exactly.
not the opposite, putting it in a real context, giving specific laws to their context, things that are happening. God wouldn't give us some of those, right? He's not going to give us the goring ox law today because people are like, well, most of us are like,
and remember,
we're not goring oxes.
Remember, a better word than laws is verdicts, because that's the first term that is used in Exodus 21. It starts talking about all these things. In other words, these are decisions. And if we use that term rather than the term laws, it might be a little easier to swallow this.
So God gives these verdicts. Is there something more in terms of, like, everybody has these for their kingdom, and so it's, again, there's like a depth to it beyond just the societal, we have this, here are the guardrails. Now, obviously they can serve that purpose. It can be a both and, but rather than just, well, I gave these law codes, well, they don't seem to be super unique. Is it, in these big kingdoms and empires, these are so important that for God to declare himself as the one true God, it makes sense to them. The God in there we have to have these things. Like,
of course.
Is there like a point to that? You know what I mean?
No.
Beyond just like.
No, I think you nailed it, that you're spot on. What else would you expect them to do? Now, here's the problem. We didn't have any of this other material until 1902. So it's 120 plus years. And when it was found, it was a shock to the system, especially when they found out, it's not news anymore, by the way, but the fact is they found out that the Hammurabi Code was much older than the Mosaic exemplars. It's like, oh my goodness, what do we do? Because they assumed for all this time that the biblical material was absolutely unique and unlike anything else. But of course, this follows the same pattern as the flood tradition, as the creation narrative, etc. And everything else I've been looking at is that the Israelites fit very well into this environment. So why wouldn't I expect them to fit, in the same way into this legal environment, except it's put, the biblical text is very complex. It's very hard, especially in its final edited form. What would you call this thing from Genesis to 2 Kings? It's got all sorts of different types of literature that has been placed into it, in many respects a seamless narrative. And so what are the laws put in? They're put inside of a treaty formula. but also it's also a narrative. And by the way, when I'm talking about this, there's really only about 60 laws in the Bible that are these social cultural laws. And so I'm not so much talking about the things in Leviticus which are instructions to priests or instructions as, that when you access the holy place, anticipating the temple, of course, but, any holy place or whatever. It's not so much that. It's the laws, especially in Exodus, about 21 to 25 or thereabouts, which are daily life laws. We have a smattering in them in Leviticus, usually of a sexual nature in Leviticus 18 through 20. Okay. Then you've got a couple in Numbers, which seem to be pretty random. The law of the what happens when a woman is suspected of adultery in Numbers 5, and Numbers 27 about the daughters of Zelophehad and again inheritance. And then you've got another smattering sort of between Deuteronomy 15 and around Deuteronomy 25, which in many respects seem to be an updating of the laws of Exodus, but they're not identical and they're not they don't overlap, but their updating seem to be anticipating a different environment. We're no longer wandering around the wilderness. We're now anticipating being settled at some point. So these are the types of laws that you would be using in a kingdom. Okay. And of course, we can talk about authorship and all that in the final edition of Deuteronomy. But the point is it's as if they've updated it. And the fact is, it's not so much the laws in Exodus are now defunct. They've been added to, I think, in the same way that the chronicler is updating the material from Kings without getting rid of the books of, in other words, we have the earlier edition and we have the later edition, and of course they complement each other. And for whatever reason, the Hebrew people decided that both of them were considered to be part of the canon itself. And maybe we can talk about how the canon was put together, but that's a little ways down the line. So again, it just shouldn't be surprising that we have this tradition, this legal tradition that is like its neighbors. And again, the uniqueness is the source behind it. You're doing this as part of a covenantal affirmation to the God who we believe is God. Okay, so the source itself is the importance to it, not so much the uniqueness of the laws.
So then I guess my little bit of, it's almost pushback, but I think it's, again, trying to help me understand it by looking at it in this new lens. Not only just the similarities between everything, but looking at it as wisdom literature, which would be, we believe the Bible is unique in as far as the author of it is the one true God.
Yes.
But the law that's given makes sense that it's similar from just the context point of view, but then God being the standard for morality and
Yes.
being the one who is good, right?
Yes.
And his call for his people to be image bearers of him. And ultimately, I think we see more of this language like in the New Testament, that the Holy Spirit being in us to conform us to look more like him,
Yes.
right? To be and act and do as he does and to serve him well. Sin is seen as rebellion, right? So you have this king. He is the king of the universe. We are called to be like him, act like him, listen to him, do as he does. But then that's kind of the wrestle, maybe even more for like the non-believers, which is, well, they're so similar. There's almost, it doesn't seem like this upgrading of morality that you would almost expect. Again, especially because I think people just they don't maybe do justice on what is divine inspiration, it being
Yes.
authoritative. It is those things, but almost wanting or expecting all of the laws to be like the Ten Commandments, where God himself comes down and writes it with his finger. So how do you reconcile that? And again, I want to give this a little caveat, right? Difficult because there's different categories of laws. But how does that work when yes, God's coming to meet us, but there's also this elevation of, but he is set apart and holy, And there's a call for us to be holy, but then some of the laws almost just look like the other people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and again, why wouldn't they? But think about it. Why are there laws in Mesopotamia? It reflects that you have to maintain the cosmic order of things, and you do it by making sure that society is run on a correct level. And so what are the laws for? Well, Hammurabi tells us what they're for: to protect the orphan and the widow, and in other words, the big guy doesn't hurt the little guy, and things like that. So and why is that the case? It's not so much because there's a good God out there. It's because this makes the earth, which is part of the cosmos, be orderly. Because if I come over and I just take your things, or if I hurt you, harm you, and your family is now hurt because of that, it actually is messing with the cosmic order. But in the Bible, and we're going to look at this when we look at the goring ox laws, in the Bible, if I do something to you, I harm you, or let's say I murder you, somebody murders you, why is that wrong? Because you've just committed treason against an image bearer. Okay, and you think about it, that's as early as Genesis 9, or maybe even 5, maybe even, I suppose with the first murder in the Bible is that, what's wrong with it is because you've actually committed treason against the divine being, and the divine being whose image you've been made in. By the way, it's image and likeness, which I think together are talking about the fact that you're a representative, but you also have the moral faculties that were given to you to act like God with justice and mercy and all these other things, long-suffering, loving kindness, etc. All those things that God's are. He made you to have the same thing. When you act out of that, you're doing something wrong. And so now so the same types of laws that are found in Mesopotamia that are done just to make sure the cosmic order runs, because of course the gods themselves don't necessarily reflect. In other words, the gods have to abide by them too. But what's the ultimate source for them? It's fate. It's the cosmic order, which is impersonal. That's the whole point. When you look at the face of the universe, it doesn't look back at you. This is what Bucciolati said in his book When on High. Here, when you look out, at the universe here, you now reflect, the divine being, who is a very, very personal being, who has expectations of you acting in accordance with your position. Okay, your position is not only an image bearer, you are now running the garden on the earth, and even though you've committed treason, you're still. By the way, the whole purpose of doing this is so you can restore that order, which, of course, in the New Testament, the restoration can only be done by a representative of our race, dying for our treason. Really, if you think about sin as treason, it just becomes, to me, a more powerful, stark, shocking thing. It's like, whoa, treason. I stole a pencil. No, that's treason. Like, okay. So again, the difference in the laws is again reflected upon the person behind them that you're doing it for, more so than the actual laws. Think about it. We looked at this with slavery. What was wrong with abusing a servant? Remember, it says, well, you were slaves in Israel, remember, and your God. And in Leviticus, we're going to see this again over and over again. Why, in Leviticus 18, the first thing that God says before he talks about sexual laws, he says, be holy as I am holy. In other words, I'm set apart, and so are you. And how are you going to be set apart? When it comes to the most intimate thing that you can think of between two human beings, sexual customs, this is how you're going to act. Okay, and this is why you do it. You do it because of the nature of the deity behind it. The Mesopotamians, they might have similar customs, but the reason behind the custom is always going to be different. And I think, again, since the church and I've talked about this till I've been blue in the face, but maybe not for a couple podcasts. When this stuff was first found in the mid late 19th century, it was a shock to the system of the Judeo-Christian world. Like, wait a minute, we got stuff that looks like the Bible. We thought it was unique. What do we do with this? And so, what was the second response to the discovery of cuneiform tablets? It was to suspect those Assyriologists. Surely you're not translating this right. I don't like what you're finding. It's offensive to me and threatening to me. And my answer is, once you get past that and realize that the difference between the systems, the meaning behind the difference in the system of Israel and the meaning behind what's happening in the rest of the Near East is so remarkably different, then the similarities are ultimately superficial. And I'm going to bring that up with the Goring Ox laws. The Goring Ox laws are so identical except for one little itty bitty difference that changes everything, in my opinion. And again, that was the great Assyriologist Finkelstein, who has the best name for an Assyriologist imaginable.
So yeah, I don't know why this has just been my topic, I guess, for this episode. So do you see it then? Because we see that, so the source of the law and everything, like what you said, how they viewed it, is Yahweh, is God himself.
Yes.
Would you say the entirety of the law, I think for this, let's shelf the 10 Commandments. You've already made the argument, right, that they're each kind of at least fitting in one of the 10 categories.
Yes.
Is it the law emanating from God, or is it simply what we're seeing? Because you've said it's almost like the law kind of gets upgraded. Again, weak word, but you know what I mean? When you're looking at Deuteronomy or Exodus, even through 2 Kings, we see that seemingly upgrade. Is it kind of like what the apologists say about slavery, which is this incremental change, and it's God bringing order, and he's setting up and establishing his kingdom first? So are the laws his laws of what he's wanting and his ideal, or is it the fact of, well, no, okay, bad analogy, but it's the Wild West. I got this ragtag group of people. I'm setting up a kingdom for myself. We saw it. He chose one person in Abraham, and he's going to bless everybody through Abraham and establish this covenantal people. And so it's still this, okay, we're setting up this people group. And so it's more of giving them a contextual law like they've all had, but okay, I'm setting up a kingdom for myself. So first, again, I have to bring order, and here's what's going on. So this is the law for this covenant people. And then we see it progress, because then we almost see an elevation of the law, obviously the fulfillment of it in Jesus, but that moral standard to us 21st century human people, it makes sense in our mind. Well, Jesus heightens it even more, where he comes in and says, well, you've heard it said, but I say, which I always think's a funny thing, because the person that we heard it from is him. I did hear from you. But then there's this elevation of it.
I don't think it's an elevation at all, myself. I think it's
a misunderstanding on us in the first place.
I think it's Jesus is a reactionary. He's going back to the original meaning of the text itself. It's not like, okay, you guys have been, down here. Let me give you a higher understanding. No, this was the understanding. This was always the original understanding of how you're supposed to act on the law. And so he's not giving them something new, in my opinion. At least that's my opinion. I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I don't think Jesus is doing anything that is shocking, except, and remember, it's
shocking to them.
Yes, because the rabbinical tradition by then, they were taking these as laws rather than verdicts. I'm saying if you take them as wisdom verdicts, and think about it, it's no different than the slavery laws. What are they for? They're exhibiting a problem. Okay. In other words, society is sinful by nature. If you think about it, will we need laws when there's no sin? No. Why would I need a law if I'm always acting in accordance with God's nature, and you're always acting in accordance with God's nature? why would I need rules?
Well, it's like, what's his face? The famous, is it Tozer or somebody who love God with all your heart and then
Augustine.
do whatever you want?
A little earlier than Tozer.
Sorry. Yeah.
But the point is that
I think Tozer might have quoted it.
Yes.
Though, so.
Well, somebody might have quoted it a few times. I think I did too. But the point is that the laws reflect a flawed culture system. Okay. And so the if part of a law is already saying, here's something that's gone haywire. And so you've got to now use it. And of course, if you think of them as verdicts, and I know it's really hard. And by the way, you think about it, in the Bible, there are probably half a dozen or more terms that are used for the laws. And of course, Torah itself means teaching. And so if you, and Greengus makes a very nice argument in another article that you really should be looking at all these terms as a composite rather than singling them all out. Oh, here it says ordinances, here it says verdicts, here it says laws. They must be something different. His answer is no, they're not. And so when you read Psalm 119, I love thy law, it's a composite of everything. I love the teaching. I love reading your Bible is basically what the writer's saying. And so the laws are reflecting a flawed culture. What do you expect them to be done? To me, this is really a larger, slavery is a subset of this. We looked at slavery and I said, all these, why are we looking at laws that are in other words, is God sanctioning this? To me, it's no different than God saying, well, he must be sanctioning theft because there's so many laws concerning people, doing thievery. And my answer, no. Here's, since we know this is going to happen, here is a manual telling you as a judge what you do in this situation. Well, I didn't find my particular situation. And of course, it's no different than the Hammurabi Code. It says, well, it just says, and here's the rabbinical problem. Deuteronomy 24, it says a man he's divorcing his wife, doesn't even talk about why whether he can or can't divorce her. The fact that he's done it, and the fact it says ultimately that he can't remarry her if she got married in between, and for them, the answer was, well, it doesn't talk about her being able to divorce, so she can't. It's like, you missed the whole point. It's the meaning in other words, this is a manual for you to use when you have one of these cockamamie situations. And of course, like we said before, there are so many things going on in general culture that aren't even addressed in the laws, but the laws are there as a guide for you to make a good decision as a judge when two families have an irreconcilable difference. In other words, you and I, our families, like I said this before, we can probably deal with it if it's something simple. My tractor, I ran over, half your field by accident. Well, okay, I'm going to give you monetarily, and you say, no, I don't accept that. It wasn't enough. Well, no, in other words, if we can't resolve our differences, now a judge has to come in and he's now going to use a law situation to make a wise decision. Of course, we have legal situations in the Bible like that. So to me, it just shows us now by looking at the ancient Near East, there's a whole world out there that they're using the same type of system. And the Israelites are saying, well, of course, it's the only system there is. What other system are we supposed to use when we're dealing with legal issues? And how are you different then? Oh, because we made a covenant with our God to act like image bearers. And so if we don't do this right, we're committing treason against the true God. So that's why. So in other words, I can't murder you. In Mesopotamia, it would affect the cosmic order, but I don't do it. Here, I can't murder you because you're an image bearer. And so I'm committing treason against who? Against God. It's just like Joseph, when he's running away from Potiphar's wife, what's the first thing he says? How can I do this against God? Yeah. He recognizes the fact that I'm if I went to do this, There aren't any. The Ten Commandments haven't even been elaborated yet, but they didn't need to be. They would have been understood by an old Babylonian period patriarch.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me, because then again, unpacking this a little bit, how I'm hearing and understanding it. So with Jesus, when Jesus gives those laws, again, it's more of, we're seeing that the people missed it because there was a heart and an intention behind it,
Yes.
because of ultimately who the law is coming from and the heart behind the law, which is God himself. But then, like you said, you're seeing these messy decisions being made because of sin itself, which makes sense, because if you want to look at it, okay, well then should we give justice? Should we give perfect justice for all of these issues, which are all treason against a holy and perfect God?
Yeah.
I think if we want the verdict to be given on that, I think we are very grateful for grace and mercy, because the New Testament, Romans tells us, the wages, what we should get as our punishment, the verdict would be death.
And I think Paul read Genesis. That's probably how he figured that out. The point is that we already found out that the first, and you might consider the slightest infraction, stealing a piece of fruit, off a tree, and what was their penalty? Death. Okay, so we already got the death penalty for everything, and so the fact that we've got all these laws and they're not all capital crimes, it's like it's already evidence of mercy.
Yeah.
We've already got the death penalty ultimately for everything that we've ever done, and so again, when Jesus does this, you think about it. When the writers are when the gospel writers are putting Jesus in this context, of course, this is before the Gentile revolution, where all the Gentiles start, rushing in and overcoming, the Jewish church in Acts 15. He's already anticipating it in some respects by saying, "All right, you guys, you missed the whole point of the law to begin with. The meaning behind it, is, you start off by." What's the first rule? Love God. And by the way, love God doesn't mean, this feeling.
Yeah.
It's you are now completely loyal to God in the same way you're now loyal to your neighbor, because of course your neighbor is an image bearer just like you are. And so again, I keep on saying the same thing, but that's because that's what it is. And that's why Jesus, and any rabbi would have listened to Jesus talking about these two laws and says, well, yeah, okay, I can't argue with that. And so he looks at the meaning behind the verdicts, I suppose you could say. If you keep on calling these verdicts, at least the 60 or so really is just 10%, but of these laws that are analogous to the Hammurabi Code, you look at them and again, I'm going to keep on saying this. Now that we have these ancient Near Eastern laws, it makes me think, boy, I would be a little suspicious if the Israelites weren't like the culture around them, at least in terms of how they think. They are in every other aspect of their culture. Why would we expect them to be different here?
So are we again kind of in a similar way, just simply overcomplicating this?
Oh, absolutely.
Me, that's what I do. Overcomplicating it in the same way of we're missing, and I just keep saying it because we're missing the heart behind, like the intention and the purpose behind the law verdict. And so again, what we're seeing with a lot of these are just simply God establishing his covenant people, and he has his holiness and his perfection in his heart and reason behind everything. And then what we're seeing are these cases that pop up.
Yeah.
And so then out of that and based on that, we're seeing the people, again, divinely inspired because it's included in there, but we're seeing the people behind it go to the best of our abilities and out of our love and our best attempt at serving God. Here are the verdicts that we have declared on these cases, and we're going to include these, and we are to live by them for future generations to understand who God is and how we've dealt with it in the past, again, to best represent and be an image bearer for God.
Yes, I think exactly right. And so, when Jesus says he fulfills the law, he doesn't abolish it. The whole point is that the meaning behind the verdicts, the reason that you're doing this has not been changed. Okay. We're not under the penalty of the law any longer. By the way, there are there are more than two, but two that come to mind that I think, especially if you're Christians, both of these people I know, one really well, one I'm getting to know is Roy Gain, Old Testament Law for Christians, Original Context and Enduring Applications. And by the way, this is one guy who was trained by that guy I keep on bringing up, Jacob Milgrom. And so I wouldn't say he's a Milgrom clone, Roy, but he certainly shows evidence of his training. So this would really be a nice addition. And the other one I just received right from the horse's mouth. I got to visit with Dick Averbeck recently, and Dick very kindly gave me, he says, "Do you have my book on Old Testament law?" I said, "No. Are you going to give me one? Great. I'd love to have it." And we're going to have Dick on in a couple months. But Dick Averbeck a couple years ago wrote The Old Testament Law for the Life of the Church, Reading the Torah in the Light of Christ. And so I think both of these are really, both of them have spent much of their lives dealing with the law in its original context and its application, which is something that I don't do. My goal is really to try to understand the original context and let others like these fellows, go further. So both of those, I think, are really, really solid and important things to say, all right, now this is really interesting now that I found out that these laws aren't as unique as I thought they were, but I still don't know what to do with them. Well, I think that both of these works, though they've got there are some nuances that are different, ultimately, they have the same type of training and interest in seeing how they are applied to the Bible believer for the New Testament age.
All right, and so to close us out, my last question, which should have easily have been my first question, so it's a great one to end with, which is, if people are still here, I don't think they're asking this question. They would have asked it 5 minutes after they left, which is, who cares and what is the importance of what we've looked at? We have the ancient Near Eastern scribal tradition connecting us to to the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Like, to most people, does it really matter, or what's the importance, or how does it ultimately change your mind, or is it kind of just everything we've been talking about? Why does it matter?
I think that maybe to summarize, because it's not like I'm going to say anything new here, to summarize is that if you now look at the legal material in the Bible as a series of verdicts that are to be used by judges to make wise decisions, rather than a code that has a particular law. In other words, is there any evidence in the Bible, as in the Hammurabi Code, that somebody comes up and says, Exodus 21:28, your ox gored, because of this, you have to do such and such or whatever. There's no evidence for that. The king makes a decision, or the judge makes a decision based upon the teachings of the verdicts that we have. And in many respects, it's a sampling. Again, like the later rabbinical tradition, they said, oh yeah, it's actually the oral corpus is even much larger than the written one. And this is a guide. However, of course, by the time of Jesus, they were now employing it as a code because they had lost a lot of the earlier tradition, and I think the meaning behind it. And so if you look at it as a series of verdicts to use as a guide to make a decision about your situation, then maybe you can look at them perhaps even more like a set of proverbs. Not identical, of course.
Yeah.
But more than a set of, concrete laws that are to be used. And I know this isn't an easy one to digest, especially as a Christian. Again, it's probably a way also to look at the context of what Paul says when he seems to be giving you very concrete statements Obviously some statements are pretty obvious. Love your neighbor. Be kind when you're doing. Those are pretty generic. But he gets to be rather specific in certain cases, especially in 1 Corinthians and in 1 Timothy. I think the principle will be the same. You better look at it in a contextual way. In other words, look at the situation that you have, and then see how it matches up in terms of wisdom with what Paul or somebody else divinely inspired says about the situation, rather than as some sort of legal code. Tough to do, and of course it's almost counterintuitive because it's not how humans like to act, because it makes things messy.
Yeah.
It's like, if you're watching some sort of situation where the Senate is demanding, or a lawyer is demanding, that you give them a yes or no answer to a question, you're saying, but what you're asking me doesn't have a yes or no answer. It's one concerning wisdom. Should you always do this when this happens? And the answer might be, well, it depends on the situation, what has happened, because if my ultimate goal is love, is it any different than when you're treating your kids? You know very well that you have to treat your older son different than the younger son because of their age. You also have to treat them differently depending on what happened, finding out, what was his heart when he said, did this or that. Oh, he wasn't being mean when he did such and such. Oh, I have to be, what am I doing there? I'm using divine wisdom to determine the best decision to make. Well,
yeah. So basically, like everything else, there's so much more nuance to it.
Yeah, it makes it harder.
It does, and it makes you have to wrestle and think until your brain hurts. But I think that's good. And hey, next episode, which I can't remember, that would be our 4th or 5th. We're finally, because we're a Bible podcast, we're finally going to get to that book, the Bible. So congrats, everybody. We're finally going to talk about the Bible next time. So excited about that. But hey, we do hope you enjoyed this. Please add to the discussion, add to my questions, write them out, because if you write out your questions, they'll make way more sense than my verbally processed ones. But we appreciate you.
Yeah.
We got everything attached below. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we're excited to continue the law in the next episode. And we'll see you next time on the Buried Bible Podcast.